Hi everyone, welcome back. In this particular video, we're going to start talking about the hydrogens in cyclohexane, or we will use the hydrogens to talk about some locations, like what are these positions in cyclohexane called. So what we did in the last video is we discussed the various conformations of cyclohexane, and we said that the chair conformation is the most stable conformation for the chair, is the most stable conformation for a cyclohexane molecule. Now, when you look at this cyclohexane model, I've sort of color-coded my hydrogens, or the bonds that represent the hydrogen atoms, or the bonds to the hydrogen atoms. Okay, notice how there are some green and there are some yellow. Now, for this ring here, if I were to imagine an axis, like if there's an imaginary axis that goes through the center of this ring, about which this ring can be rotated, then notice how the green carbon-hydrogen bonds, they are all parallel to that axis. So if there's an imaginary axis in the center, then these carbon-hydrogen bonds are parallel to that axis. So these hydrogens, or the hydrogens that are located along those positions, they are called axial hydrogens in a cyclohexane. So cyclohexane has two kinds of hydrogens, has two types of hydrogens, and these in general are talking about positions in hydrogen in a cyclohexane structure. The first is the axial hydrogens, or the axial position. Okay, and the second one, the second kind of hydrogens are called equatorial hydrogens, or it represents an equatorial position. Okay, so like I said, in this particular case, the green carbon-hydrogen bonds, they are all parallel to that imaginary axis about which this ring can be rotated. And so all the green carbon-hydrogen bonds are axial, or those represent the axial positions. And the yellow carbon-hydrogen bonds, those are along, like approximately around the equator, okay, for this ring. And so that's why they're called equatorial hydrogens, or those positions are called equatorial positions. Now, as we discussed earlier, this cyclohexane molecule, it can go through various conformations. So it is in this chair conformation, okay? Now, the headrest in this chair conformation can become the footrest, and the footrest can become the headrest, so that we get to the next chair conformation. So that's another chair conformation. But what happened to the hydrogens now, or the positions now? If you look at it in this next conformation, or in this other chair conformation, okay, this is the chair conformation. That's what we have. So in this other chair conformation, looks like the yellow bonds, or the yellow hydrogens, or those positions are now axial. They are parallel to that imaginary axis. They're pointing up and pointing down. And the green carbon-hydrogen bonds, they're actually along the equator, or those are equatorial now. And so what that means is, when a cyclohexane goes from one chair conformation to another chair conformation, its equatorial and axial positions, they change places, or they basically go from being axial to equatorial. So whatever is axial in one conformation becomes equatorial in the other conformation, and the two chair conformations that are possible. So that's very important to keep in mind, okay? That as the cyclohexane goes through the conformation and goes from one chair conformation to another chair conformation, the hydrogens change well, the hydrogens don't change positions, but their nature changes. They go from an axial position to an equatorial position, okay? From an axial position to an equatorial position. So they change their position in some sense, okay? You're not breaking any bonds. It's only the ring twisting and then going from one conformation to another, but that changes which position the hydrogen occupies, whether it's an axial position or an equatorial position. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to actually start drawing out some of these. We'll actually learn to draw a cyclohexane and then draw out the equatorial and axial positions of the hydrogens here. So to draw a cyclohexane now, we should be able to draw both conformations, chair conformations of a cyclohexane. So what I know the book takes you through a certain, and depending on the resource, you will see various ways that you can draw a cyclohexane. I think what I find easiest to do is if I have to draw one conformation of cyclohexane, I'm going to draw two parallel lines, basically slanting lines, okay? And these lines are offset by a bit, okay? So they don't really start at the same point or end at the same point. So they're offset slightly, okay? But they're two slanting parallel lines. And then what I do is from the tip of the line, which is pointing up, okay, draw a line down and then go up to meet the other, to meet the tip of the other line, which was pointing up. And then from the tip of the line, which is pointing down, draw a line up. So if it is pointing down, go up. If it was pointing up, then go down and then come meet the other line. So since it was pointing down here, went up, and then I come down and join the other line. And what I've drawn here is a decent cyclohexane. Okay, that's good enough. So that's one conformation of cyclohexane. In the other conformation, so in this particular conformation of cyclohexane, notice this is the headrest, that's the footrest, and this portion here represents our seat. Okay, now for this other conformation, of the cyclohexane, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw two parallel lines such that they slant in the opposite direction. Okay, and then I'm going to do something similar. From the tip that is pointing up, I will draw a line going down and then join the other line at the tip that's pointing up. And then from the tip which is pointing down, I will go up and then come down to meet the other line. And I've got the two conformations, the two chair conformations, like the skeleton is there, okay? So notice the way I read this is if I had to number these carbons in some sense, and let's say if I say this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, okay? Carbon number 1 was the headrest, carbon number 4 was the footrest, and now in this conformation, carbon number 1 is the footrest, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we have 6. So now carbon number 1 is the footrest and carbon number 4 is the headrest. So I'm drawing both conformations of the cyclohexane. So essentially what I did is I pulled this down and I pulled it up, and that is what I would get. Okay. Now, once we have the skeleton of the cyclohexane, we can add the hydrogens to the cyclohexane. I don't have like a yellow marker, so I'm going to use a red instead. So we'll use a green and a red. Now, to draw axial hydrogens, okay, if the carbon, or if a carbon is pointing up compared to the other carbons it is connected to, then axial bond, okay, it's an axial bond or the position points up, okay, and then you basically do vice versa, okay, just the opposite of that. So let's look at the first cyclohexane here, and let's start with carbon number 1. So when I look at carbon number 1, which is here, which is that corner, it is pointing up with respect to 6 and 2, which are the other 2 carbons that it's connected to. So axial hydrogen on carbon number 1 will point up. It will point up. Okay, that's how I'm going to draw the axial hydrogen. Look at carbon number 3. It is pointing up compared to the other 2 carbons. So in this particular case, again, the axial hydrogen points up. If I look at 5, compared to 4 and 6, 5 is pointing up. So axial on this would point up. Now, vice versa means if the carbon is pointing down, then your axial hydrogen or the axial bond is going to point down. The axial position is going to point down. So if we look at 6 compared to 5 and 1, it is pointing down. So that means axial hydrogen or the axial position points down. 2 is pointing down. So axial position points down. 4 is pointing down, so the axial position points down. Now, once you've drawn in all your axial positions, so these are axial, we can denote that by using the subscript A. Again, I'm just doing this for detail, if I have to show the detail, okay? And then for a carbon where the axial position is pointing up, the equatorial position points down, but not like completely down, okay? So if the axial is pointing down, axial is pointing up, then the equatorial points down, and then we can draw the equatorial position there, okay? Similarly, when the axial is pointing down, then equatorial points up. Axial is pointing down, equatorial points up. Axial is pointing up, equatorial points down. Axial is pointing up, so equatorial points down. Axial is pointing down, equatorial points up. And we've basically completed all the positions or all the bonds in our cyclohexane. Okay, so we have the axial hydrogens and we have the equatorial hydrogens. Now, if this cyclohexane does the flip, right? If we flip the chair, okay, flip the chair, and if we basically go with this labeling scheme, and actually we'll go ahead and fill in all the axial and the equatorial hydrogens, okay? So on carbon number 1, green was equatorial in the first chair conformation. That means in the next chair conformation, on the other chair conformation, there are only 2 chair conformations possible. So if it is equatorial in one of the chair conformations, then in the other chair conformation, this must be axial, okay? So what we're going to do is so this is equatorial, that must also be axial. So essentially for this, what we will do is we'll try to use green for the axial positions now to stay with the color scheme, okay? So if the carbon is pointing up, again, axial points up. If the carbon is pointing up, axial points up. If the carbon is pointing up, axial points up. If the carbon is pointing down, axial points down. If the carbon is pointing down, axial points down. Carbon is pointing down, axial points down. So those are all the axial positions. So I've maintained the same color scheme to say that whatever hydrogen was equatorial in the first chair conformation, they are axial in the other chair conformation. And similarly for every carbon, when the axial is pointing up, then equatorial points down. Axial is pointing down, equatorial points up, axial pointing up, equatorial points down, axial pointing down, so equatorial points up, equatorial down, and equatorial up. So we've completed all of those positions. So we have the axial and the equatorial. And again, like we saw in the model itself, the most important thing to remember is that the axial and the equatorial positions, or the bonds, they switch, they go from, well, the bonds go from being axial to equatorial as the chair flips. So if it is axial in one conformation, one chair conformation, in the other chair conformation, it's going to be equatorial now. That is the most important thing to remember here. Okay, so that's how you would draw the chair conformation, and those are all the positions. Okay, it has two types of positions, or bonds is the better, I would say, terminology, okay, because it's not just hydrogens. We will be talking about other groups in this positions also, okay? So we have axial positions, and then we have equatorial positions. So in the next set of videos, we will actually start looking at substituted cyclohexanes. That means when you have a substituent on a cyclohexane, then how does that influence the stability of the cyclohexane? When there are no substituents, these two chair conformations, they have equal stability. That means the cyclohexane spends 50% of its time in this conformation and 50% of time in the other conformation, because there are no differences between the two conformations. So the cyclohexane keeps going back and forth between these conformations. And as it is doing that, it is going through the boat and the twist boat and half chair, all of those conformations in between. Okay, so that is what happens. So that will be all. Bye.